Good morning, this is Emily Freitag with Instruction Partners, and I'm so pleased to be with Deborah Ball today talking about rethinking intervention and centering on the question of what do we know about what works to support and accelerate student learning, and what do we know does not work. Deborah Ball, thank you so much for taking the time, and as we're starting all of these interviews, I'd love just to hear your story as a person and as a learner, and how that frames your perspective on what learning entails and how we can think about accelerating learning.
Sure. When I learned that you wanted to ask me a bit about my own experience as a child or as a learner, I had to step back for a moment and realize something I hadn't really noticed before, which is, you may or may not know this, but I have a pretty deep skepticism about how wedded we are to the notion of grade level, which absolutely creates the way we think about learning, which is completely artificial. There are some reasons why we use grade level, but there's a lot to say about what's extremely problematic about the concept. I mean, an example would be to say someone is at grade level or not requires us to decide to prioritize and privilege particular things over others. There isn't really any way to say that a child is at grade level or not. Even within a subject area, it doesn't make sense, let alone overall. But then I realized that it does actually go back to my own experience as a child, where multiple times I was aware that grade level didn't capture anything about my own situation. I don't think I ever could have said that at all. But I had multiple experiences in which I was a misfit as it pertained to grade level, and didn't have good experiences as a result. And I hadn't realized before that maybe my skepticism dates back to before I was skeptical about grade level as a teacher, which I very explicitly was almost immediately upon becoming a teacher. But your question makes me realize that in this case, so one example would be, as a child who came to school having learned to read very young, I was a big problem for my first grade teacher, and ended up with some extremely unpleasant experiences that positioned me very poorly with other children as a first grader who could read. And I know that that's a story about privilege, about already being able to read, as opposed to being quote behind, which is what grade level does to kids too. But the being so-called ahead also was painful and didn't make me friends and really set me off poorly at school. And there were other experiences like that where my own experience about what I understood and didn't wasn't well calibrated to what grade I was supposed to be in. Sometimes it means I was ahead, which is a completely fake idea, but sometimes it was also that learning was like orthogonal to the idea of grade level and didn't fit well. And I multiple times found myself at odds with the grade level structure. So that is one thing. It's also the case that I probably knew from a very early time that a great deal of children's learning occurs not in school at all. And like most children, I don't think that schools have ever been well prepared to pay attention to what children learn in their own culture, in their own environment, from whatever it is about their families. Clearly, schools privilege particular kinds of knowledge that middle class and white children do get at home often, but if we tried to zoom into that a little bit more, I think we could understand that schools are set up with a kind of, not only a grade level as a rigid idea, but a very flat idea about what it is that children can do, ought to do, might know, that doesn't correspond well at all to the differences among families. So that's a second view about learning that I think goes way back into my childhood. It's just that I hadn't thought about, I'd always thought that that came about because I taught in a school where children were so diverse that the typical structures of schooling, like grade level or being behind or ahead or below or any strange positional words that we use, didn't apply in my teaching situation. But now I'm realizing that it may date back to my own experience as a child.
I think so much of our impression of school really is formed in our own student experience. But take us now then into your experience as an educator and as a researcher, and let's start in a place of optimism. Like, what have we seen works, and what do we know about what works? And in particular, mathematics education is your focus, and feel free to take us deep into that discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I was an elementary teacher, and I think of myself as an elementary teacher, so I know my identity in the field is really centered in mathematics. But I think because we do know a lot about English language arts, and there'll be plenty of people who can talk about that, I think I will choose to talk about math, since I do currently do a lot of my work in and around elementary math.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested more generally in elementary children and their learning, but math is a particularly good place to do that work and to think about the competence of children, to think about how to disrupt inequities. Math has a grip of structure around children that actually limits their learning. So it is a real opportunity right now to kick off the kind of stranglehold that grade level has in math and start thinking more deliberately about what does it mean to be mathematically competent? What is mathematical thinking? What are mathematical ideas? And to see whether we can just loosen that grip a bit more when we're thinking about what children may or may not be learning right now when they're not in the normal organization of schooling. But I really hope that the thinking we're able to do right now, because we're being pushed to do that thinking, might carry over to allow us to break free of the very linear and hierarchical way, and to some extent extremely narrow way that we've constructed mathematics in school. And I think it's an opportunity to do that because we need to do that. We also want to say that that is a very tall order in some ways, because in order to think more broadly about what mathematical competence is and what children might just be able to like think about and do and already do, you actually have to know something about math to recognize and to notice those kinds of things, to think about what kind of questions are mathematical that we might have even very young children like thinking about and playing around with and working on that would be deeply complex for them and advance their learning. But it would require us to break out of thinking, oh, let me see if I can find a worksheet online that will make sure that they're continuing their work on addition facts, or that they're thinking about linear equations, or whatever the content is. If we go to the internet and look at worksheets, we're going to be buying back into that very narrow structure of what it means to be smart at math, what it means to be good at, and what math even is. So I think what we know but have rarely been able to act on is the idea that mathematics actually is a whole sort of set of ways of thinking and kinds of problems, kinds of questions that little children, beginning with their very young age and certainly going on through elementary school and further, think about, have an affinity for, that don't correspond well to thinking about whether kids are behind or ahead. So for example, every time children organize things categorically, and children do this all the time, they're thinking about attributes, they're thinking about structure. The Common Core standard, just to talk about standards for a moment, has as one of the 8 mathematical practices, finding, identifying, and working with mathematical structure. In general, that practice hasn't been foregrounded much in some of the work on the Common Core, but when it has, my observation is it's often been quite trivial, when in fact mathematical structure is one of the main sort of key ideas to be looking for structure, and categorization is one of those structures, and there are many others as well. Children are able to categorize, group, think about arrangements, think about order in novel ways. Now that takes me back to my point about understanding some math yourself, because once I say that, it's possible to reduce that to a very narrow set of things like shapes or color. Actually, children are quite capable of thinking of different ways to organize and different ways to order things. And the very notion of doing that is mathematical. So there are a lot of examples of that are possible. There are lots of possibilities of thinking about orders of magnitude for slightly older children. Like we don't really think very well with children about what not just counting or adding or computing, but like, how do you understand how much something is, or how big something is, or what it means for something to be less than something else? By getting so wedded to thinking about how we use the greater than and less than symbol and keeping it so narrow, we really neglect the possibility of children beginning to wonder about and think about things that are very large or very small, or what does it even mean to ask like how big something is or how much something is. And in their everyday lives, which their learning is now situated in, or at least potentially situated much more in their everyday lives, can we figure out what some of these really key mathematical questions and ideas are, and support children to be supported in thinking about those things in their everyday life right now? Could we think about things that could be available, that families could access, but don't rely on parents becoming the teachers of fraction concepts? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And by saying that, I don't mean that parents or families or grandparents or friends of families who are interacting with children shouldn't help. That's not the point. But it's actually not that simple to listen to children's mathematical ideas and begin to develop those. So the more we could be understanding what children do think about and are able to think about and create spaces for them to do that and reinforce that, we'd be doing them a lot of good when it comes to thinking about accelerating. And I think that's something we learn and take forward when we think about, let's say we don't know exactly what schooling might look like, not only next fall, but in the future. We've never really done the kind of hard thinking about what we mean by homework in math either. So it's a similar type of thinking, but on a smaller scale. Like what kinds of things can kids do outside of the context of being in groups with other children and with the teacher? What are other mathematical things they already think about that they could be doing? Because the difference between being in school and being at home is, at home there's a wider range of sort of territory that you can explore from a spatial point of view, from a probabilistic point of view, from a numerical or combinatorial point of view. So once you have an awareness as an adult that math is all of those things, it's about space, it's about pattern, it's about probability, it's about counting and enumeration. And if you get some eyes as a family of what are those spaces where little children are constantly operating and create experiences around, talk, draw, represent some of their ideas, that might inform us about what's useful to do for homework also. The idea of school learning and stuff it into Zoom doesn't make any sense in the long run. But I think what we really want to talk about here is acceleration. So we worry a lot that if regular schooling as we've known it doesn't occur in the same ways all of the time, how are we going to ensure that a whole set of children, particularly children who often don't get the opportunities for complex thinking and kind of quality content, what's going to happen? Is this only going to, as you've written about, magnify inequities? And the answer to that is clearly yes, those inequities already exist. Yeah. And the more we subscribe to these, ideas that we think of as advancing equity, but actually are going to probably further narrow and constrain children's development, the worse it's going to be. So I think the answer is something we have known, which is children are capable at a very young age of working on very complex problems. And I think you asked me earlier about my own experience. I think that this came earliest for me when I taught first grade, and I taught in an extremely multicultural, very multilingual school. And as I became more puzzled about my children's learning of mathematics, I had the opportunity to play around with some curriculum materials that are really pretty different from a lot of the things that we typically see. And as I ventured into those and asked my children to think about questions that these materials supported me to ask, I was blown away by what 6-year-olds, some of them who weren't even very fluent English speakers or hadn't had those kind of opportunities before, like completely jumped into problems. Number problems where on Monday I would say, I'm thinking of a mystery number and here's one clue, and they would instantly start trying to like make a list of numbers that could be that number. And then I would like on Tuesday say, well, I'm going to give you one more clue, and they would hang with these problems for a whole week, and by the end of the week, pretty positive that they'd isolated the mystery number. So across the week it was like process of elimination, trying to think about what I know, what I don't know, using number concepts. Like a clue could be something like my number is even. So, okay, here's using concepts you might want to know, but it was in the space of figuring something out. So that's an example where it wasn't like, let's do something about, that you're doing at home and make it numerical or spatial, which is also a good idea. It's also, they like puzzles. They like to think about things that are uncertain or unclear. They like problems that don't have single answers and may even have infinitely many answers. There are lots of things like that we could begin making available that wouldn't require a huge amount of support. Children could actually be doing them. They'd probably like them a lot better than being sort of funneled into working on worksheets, but they would answer your question about acceleration because they would be having a much broader diet of mathematical experience. I think that's which I'd really like to figure out collectively about how we could support opportunities for that. And I think not only would that help us in the current situation we find ourselves in, but would be a big breakthrough for the kind of constraints that we've forced elementary math and middle school and high school into.
Yeah. Your comment about just how innate this love of problem solving is just totally resonates. Take us back for a second into a little bit the structure of the discipline. And what we've been talking to people about are kind of some of the metaphors we may carry in our heads about how learning works that actually might not be that productive. So for example, this notion of sequential and linear learning, dominoes falling one after another, doesn't necessarily seem to be true to the discipline and how we actually learn things, and yet might feel like it is when you hear things like, well, we have to diagnose and then go back and pick back up. Tell us a little bit about, and then I was struck as you were talking about just how much trauma so many people have about their own math identity, and how much work there is, you know, to do to help not only parents, but also teachers, even math teachers, sort of recover a wholer sense of math and a wholer sense of their efficacy as mathematicians. So can you connect those two and just talk about the kind of, this is a crazy question, but like, tell us what you think math is and the construct, and then how you would imagine so many people who might have an alternate view recovering a fuller view.
Well, I mean, the question of what math is has a lot of different answers, and there are quite a few people who have done very substantial work to uncover the things that are mathematical that other cultures and other histories have deeply worked on that don't find their way into our school curriculum. And I want to be very careful to acknowledge that that's a very important thing to be thinking about and to be acknowledging. A dilemma is that once you are looking at, let's say, things that seafaring peoples did to navigate the ocean, which are clearly had involved a huge amount of what we would call mathematical reasoning very legitimately, two problems arise. One is it's often treated as like exotic and folklore rather than actual serious mathematics. But a more complicated problem is that in order to call it mathematics, you're probably still using dominant Western conceptions of mathematics to name that mathematics. So the kind of dilemma that you're not really asking me about is, what are the kinds of mathematics that we don't even know how to see, that people have invented and used, that don't get privileged and don't get prioritized, but also we don't even know how to see them? And I'm not actually going to answer about that right now, but I spend
and you're bringing up, and who gets to choose.
I think we've done better work on that. When I think about the work of Megan Bang in science, we've done much better work to understand how Indigenous peoples have ways of thinking about the natural world that are really have integrity in their own right, and we're not just using concepts from Western science to name that as science. But anyway, setting that all aside for the moment, not because I think it needs to be aside, but because I'm not an expert at this and I'm trying to puzzle about it. If I return to some basic concepts of what I understand currently, I would think of as mathematics. I think of particular kinds of domains of question asking. So questions that have to do with how likely something is. So we call that probability, but the whole realm of trying to quantify the likelihood of something is a really natural kind of question. We know from research that in general, adults aren't any better at reasoning about probability than children are. And part of that is we don't teach it much, and we also don't teach it particularly well. It's actually quite difficult to learn to reason about probability. And we know a lot from psychology about how, you know, recency influences whether you think something's probable, whether you yourself have experience with something, and vice versa. You think something's unlikely. People tend to make both types of errors. So much more experience for children to learn to think about what does it mean to ask if something is likely to happen or not, and to learn that there are actually tools for trying to get on top of that and systematize that to be able to answer that question. That's a realm. So that question, sort of what is something likely, is an example of a core mathematical question. Another would have to do with space, how things fit together, how things relate to one another, how things are organized. Questions, you know, one of my colleagues said to me, like the activity of packing your trunk of your car when you have a ton of stuff you're trying to take somewhere, like how you how to pack those things into a trunk is a mathematical question. Doesn't mean it has to be into a formula, but the reasoning about how you pack a bunch of objects into a confined space is itself a question. It's an example of the questions that are in the realm of space. The subject matter we often refer to is like measurement or geometry, and that's fine. But it also goes to a basic human question about how we arrange things, about the size of things. You know, questions like how big something is, or how we know that one thing is bigger than another, or the different kinds of answers to questions about bigness are really rich and important. And I think we end up thinking mostly about weight and length with children, but there are tons of other questions that have to do with bigness, and that we kind of blithely assume that they're going to understand all our kinds of measurement. Like measurement of time is a really different kind of thing than measurement of length. Measurement of volume is different than measurement of weight. There's lots fundamental questions about how we answer questions about what's more than something else and when we can compare and what, as you get into it, you learn more like technical things you can do, but the fundamental human question, like the probability question, is like how much or how much more. There's space, arrangement, pattern, and I didn't really even talk about pattern. Then obviously there's things about how we enumerate, how we count, how we record, how we combine, how we split up, and all things that have to do with combinatorial ideas. And later, of course, have to do with things that are more algebraic. That's a whole realm of thinking about how you count, how you pattern, how you see relationships, how you look at proportions. Lots of questions. How do you know if something's going faster than something else? Is a really interesting question, and that's an example that's on the intersection between more the measurement question and the question of combinatorial. So I think of the questions of like number, in the simplest of terms, number, space, probability are all examples of core domains of mathematics, and they each come with a whole bunch of like basic human questions that are asked in a lot of different ways and answered in different ways. What I don't know is whether there aren't also some other domains that in Western mathematics we haven't really paid attention to, and I think it's likely that that's true. But even if we start with and it involves a lot of structuring, a lot of kind of naming of things. Naming is another big part of mathematics. So you think of algebra is really about naming. Equivalent fractions is really about naming. So like, those are the things that in teacher education, like our own experience becoming teachers, we don't ever see that picture, and that makes it really hard to appreciate what children are thinking about and to be able to connect with them. So I think that your question about
interesting
that nobody gets that bigger picture. It's just not offered. It's not taught. It's not explained. So you're like blindly trying to help children with little minutia. It's nobody's fault. And the curriculum almost encourages it more because we're so fearful that it's all linear. Mathematics is one subject that's probably most subject to being thought of in hierarchical linear ways. And yet there's nothing about it that makes it linear. There's no reason that you have to like learn to add before you can learn to, divide. Those things are not in a linear order, and yet they're locked into the school curriculum.
In that way. So interesting. I'm almost, as you talk here, like picturing these pillars of questions that, kind of overlap, but, and that we're holding place for there being other pillars that we might not even be seeing. So interesting. Well, thank you so much. I'm taking away so much from this conversation about the relationship between, what we do in school and just a bigger world that is fundamentally a mathematical world, and how we can connect those more effectively. Any final thoughts, or anyone you think we should be learning from?
I think if we're worrying about what's going to happen when children may not have had formal or informal opportunities, you asked earlier, like, what do we know? I think what we know is that when you layer mathematical learning opportunities in the form of problems, you can do what you talked about nicely in your blog, which is there are ways to bring into children's awareness things that they may not have gotten instruction on, but they don't have to go back. So a favorite problem of mine that like is actually good across many grade levels is to ask children to write equations for 10. First graders can do that really easily, but it's actually a very challenging problem for older children because there's so many different ways you can make equations that, for 10. The more operations you know, the more ways you have of working. And pretty quickly, even very young children realize there are infinitely many such equations, which is super exciting. Think about what happens when you're working on it. First of all, you can work on it depending on what tools you have available to you in terms of arithmetic skills or other kinds of reasoning, pattern skills. You'll be able to generate different kinds of things, but you'll never finish, which is really good for learning perseverance. But it also makes you feel super excited. Like the idea that you could write 100 equations and then you're like, wait, I can think of another one is amazing. But while you're doing it, you are practicing what we often think of as basic computational skill, right? So you are doing some like learning of things that you might not have had instruction in. But meanwhile, you're asking a bigger question, which is like, how many such equations are there? So that's an example of packaging some really basic, what very recognizable math, arithmetic, together with a question that's much bigger and more like stimulating of the imagination of a child, that really has a problem that has no end. And there are lots of examples of kind of what I think of as layered problems, where there are opportunities to be filling in things that might not have had instruction, or the instruction wasn't very, didn't connect for the child, at the same time that they're way pushing up into things that are like more abstract, more exciting, more like stimulating of their imagination, more open to multiple ways of being solved. Like, those two things don't have to be separated. So I think that's part of it.
And they can be so fun. I mean, I hear your story and I'm like, gosh, you could engage kids for hours in some of these problems right now, which lots of parents would love help.
You can map that to the Common Core. I'm not dissing that we have standards. It's just that mapping activity, it shouldn't take the priority. Like children's own ability to think should be in the foreground. It's our responsibility to keep track of things that we hope that they'll be able to use and know by the time they finish school. Not their job, that journey.
So helpful. Thank you so much for taking time. We will come back to you with more questions, no doubt, over time if we
Emily,
want to explore further.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Deborah.